All right, tell me about what field you're in, Sonny.
Okay, yes.
You've been looking for work long?
Okay. So the small group work, if it works in one context, such as business, or it works in community development, from my experience, it also works in the field of education. So the fact that it works in all these different contexts, I think what's important is to understand what are some of the underlying principles of small group that make it effective.
Well, the principles grow out of the larger context. So the larger context, wherever you are in this culture, is to be in essentially a patriarchal world, a world of empire, a world of business perspectives, a world that wants to automate and commodify and mechanize all things, including me. A world that treats me as a performer early on in the game, as you well know, and you've taught me, and said we're not interested in learning, we're interested in performance. So that's the world we are creating. So given that, it isolates us from each other. It individualizes me. It tells me that it disembodies me and tells me that my brain is all that matters. And it puts the Napoleonic hat of the normal curve on my head at the age of 9, 8, and tells me that I have to compete with you. And so given that as a kind of a received narrative or wisdom, for people to rediscover their learning capacity, to discover their curiosity, to open space for themselves and their own lives, we have to get reconnected. That if I walk into a room in isolation, I don't hear half of what's going on in that room. Even when I go to church, I sit in the back of the sanctuary so I can get out quickly. So what the small group does is it's a device in 1,000 variations of how people get reconnected, of how people discover they're not alone. And why do that? Because all performance, all learning, all optimism, all physical health is dependent on my connectedness.
So there's an acknowledgement of interdependence or an enactment of interdependence in the small group.
Deeper than that, it's intimacy.
Okay.
It's raw connection. It's a declaration. I mean, everywhere you break them into small groups and give them something to talk about and say, what happened to you? Someone in the room will say, I discovered I'm not as alone as I thought I was. And we're so immune to it that we don't even know how isolated we are.
So one of the things I noticed in practice is that there's a relationship between curiosity, as you've described it. To be really in dialogue means to listen to another person and to be curious about how they make sense to themselves, rather than to be in judgment about what they're saying. So there's a shift. And you often describe it when you say, ask open questions.
Ask questions that are personal anxiety provoking.
And that relationship then between curiosity and empathy shows up.
So what you said that's important to me is that it's my willingness to try to understand how the world occurs to you, rather than my eagerness to let you know how the world occurs to me and then fit you into it. So every time somebody says, oh, let me put that in my own words, it means that they're into their own world, fine. They're not into your world or that world. And so what you're doing in the classroom is reconstructing my willingness to be interested in another person's world.
And that's radical.
It's an alternative way of being in this culture, in a culture that breeds entitlement, in a millennial culture, X culture. And once I can decide to understand how the world occurs to you, everything changes. Then I realize, I know you're making it up, but then so am I. So I don't have to defend my world. And so something like that happens. And the questions do it, and it can be almost about anything. I think the proximity does it. I think being with a stranger does it. The biggest obstacle to surprise is familiarity. And if I think I know you, I'm done. Done being surprised by you. Then I think you're predictable. Once I've done that, then what am I going to learn? You know, and so you're always bringing the strangers together. And to me, that's more important than the question. It's more important than anything, is the stranger together, because I don't know I can be with strangers. I've been so like-minded that I think I can only be happy or whole or alive with people of my own kind. And we'll go to any length. So it strikes me that all the fear of immigration, of the alien, of the stranger, of the other, you know, is what you're trying to balance or do something about in these stupid little devices. So get in a small group with people you know the least. Don't wait to be chosen. So you're really trying to create a sense of ownership, accountability, citizenship, agency, pick your word. And that's what you need in the classroom for these kids to learn something important. We're outsourcing the classroom now. You can't teach at a university without half your course being online, as if knowledge transfer was the point.
So what was the process of discovery? I mean, you didn't know this all at once. So this was a series of experiences or experiments.
Well, it grows out of my own sense of isolation, my own sense of feeling alone, needing to compete, needing to be right, having an answer. So once you get a taste of an alternative, it's a window that only opens, it doesn't close. So for me, it started when I went to graduate school and they threw us in a T group, which is the best entry-level job in the world. You sit down with a group of 8 people, call it a class, and say, okay, what we do is up to you, and your job is to learn from your interactions. Zip. And so that, I never even come close to being in a room where relationships were the point. And it took me years to get that and see what that meant to me.
So we moved that into the educational field, for example, where the core competencies are obedience, predictable outcomes, ability to compete with other and win. So the small group, there's a process that happens when they go into the small group that really works backwards against those forces.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious about the almost alchemical process that happens when people come together in that way that tends to push back this. No, please go ahead.
I would call it a political reconfiguration. It's a political act to have people who want to compete, who want to be right, who want to please, who are trained into being well behaved, all right? To put them in a small group and put in their hands some of the means of what's going on in that classroom is a political act. You're trying to redistribute power in that classroom. And against all odds, including you, including me. So you're renegotiating a social contract. But you're doing it in a way that people don't know how to defend against. Look, all I'm asking you to do is sit in a small group. What's the big deal? You know, sit closer. All I'm asking is be with a stranger. And if you're clear about it, people will do it. Nobody comes to anything I do with the idea of wanting to sit in a small group. If you tell people, come to this event, we're going to sit in small groups. If I told my family, come to this event, we're going to sit in small groups, they wouldn't show up. The dog would eat their homework. And so you have to lie about it, but it's so conditioned, but that's what you do. And now you don't do it because that's the point. There is content in that classroom. The world needs healing, it needs fixing. But you speed up everything if you create a different context with which then you do the problem solving. And then you just play with it. Is it 3 or is it 5 or is it 7? How long is long enough? You get compulsive about idiot details. You learn to always break the group before they're ready, because then you sustain energy. So you become energetically thoughtful. And every time energy goes down in the room, after a while, you say, I don't have to live with that. I know I came to make a point and haven't got to it yet, but what's the point of making a point if nobody's interested? And so you just start watching the energy. And when it goes down, I know things are not going well. It does not take a sophisticated diagnostic moment that when people have lost interest in you and what you're up to, you got a problem. So I know what to do now. If they're in small groups, I bring them back together. If they're together, I break them into small groups.
Shift the field.
Yeah, exactly.
So what, when you go into organizations or you work with groups of people, what's the outcome that you see as a most prevalent outcome from the, and I'm not talking about planned, I'm talking about what just happens to people when and to organizations when they actually
People relax.
develop intimacy in this way.
People relax. They almost look forward to being together. They occasionally smile. And they are energized. Now, whether they produce more of this or that, I know they learn more. We know that. I know they're healthier. I know that. And you can feel it. It's a visceral sensation. And it doesn't matter how many are in the room. Now, it's so fragile, it's frightening. So it's unsustainable. You say, what can we do to sustain the sense of connection that we have? The answer is nothing. But I do have a suggestion. Next time you come together, why don't you sit in a small group with people you know the least? Don't wait to be chosen and stop being so damn helpful to each other. So there are some protocols you can. And I know that when the small group is done, the final thing to do is tell them what they appreciated from each other. Simple, stupid things. And so you're totally reconstructing the belief system about how learning occurs in a classroom. It doesn't occur from teaching. It occurs as a social phenomenon that you can begin to design towards.
So there's if we amplified that to the aesthetics of society, to me that's an aesthetic moment when you shift the fundamental values of being together. We amplify that to society. What happens to a community, or what could happen in a community? Some of the aesthetics are leadership is distributed into the small groups at that moment. Nobody's in control. So I'm just curious about the things you would amplify into the way we are as human beings together in the larger sense.
It takes parallel shifts in a whole bunch of domains. So we can't live with the economic system we've got now and expect the small group to compete against that. You know, I can't live with the social structures we have now. You know, so over time you need to invent things that deal with the economy, that deal with bringing art back into the center of our existence. But every time you gather is an occasion to welcome each other in from exile. Not because that's necessarily the point, but that creates the condition where whatever your bigger thing you're up to can happen. So you would reconstruct the church. So the church is organized by certainty, as demonstrated by pews lined up, facing the professional, bolted to the floor. So wherever you want to go. Now there's certain, you just pay attention to what you call that aesthetic, and you do what you can. So you spend your life as an interior decorator. That's all I do, is go into rooms wherever I'm invited and rearrange the room. That's my intervention. And if I had any faith in humanity, I would leave as soon as the rearranging was done. I would.
Nothing, your work is done at that point.
So you have a couple of things you've taught me. One is that as soon as you go from a learner to a performer, I've stolen your humanity, comma, and therefore you feel entitled for that theft. The other is with your comments about Maturana saying that math is learning how to live together, the small group, all right, in the presence of a math teacher.
I've noticed a couple other things too. It's been transformational in a personal sense. I think if this stuff is true, it's just true, and there's an experience that's self-validating or self-verifying. And one of the things I've noticed is that when I am really deeply curious about another person, I move into empathy and love. And those are words that never have come that easily to me, but to actually have that experience. And we move into care. And so I think one of the things that intimacy does is it promotes this sense of care and empathy for other, which could conceivably impact how you choose to act in the world in other ways. So if we're talking about economics, the shift of economics from the winner-take-all strategy and the competitive strategy into a cooperative strategy, where I actually care about the people who I didn't care about before, who I just looked at as a means to an end.
Right.
So that the reciprocity of what I take and what I give comes more into balance. The area of leadership, where, for example, we look at the leaders of corporation and the disparate amount of money that they make relative to the people actually producing the product. And so suddenly this notion of the exalted leader to a collective is a shift, is an economic shift as well as a political shift, potentially.
What you're doing in what you just said is you're taking a couple of principles and producing meaning out of it in your language.
Yeah.
See, I don't think in those terms. I'm not after care and love and empathy. I don't know why, but so that's why you create an experience in the world, and then people will create their own story about it, what it's doing for them.
Yeah.
So you don't have to promise this is going to do something for you.
Right.
And it comes in 1,000 ways.
Well, I think that moves to the unpredictability of it, which is what makes it effective, is what meaning I take from it, what I notice is peculiar to my own experience through that process, rather than you telling me what's going to happen to me. You're not making me a promise.
Right.
I agree with that, yeah.
And then all the things we complain about, so I don't worry about the people making all that money at the top of corporations. Once we get ourselves together, that'll balance out. Because I'm going to stop buying from those corporations. They're only making a lot of money because they have my dollars. And so there's a politics of a dollar you start worrying about.
Yeah.
And where you get your food. And can you walk or drive,
So there's a simplicity about all of this. It's not that complicated.
It's not complicated, it's just hard. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. And the people worst at it are the people who facilitate it. So you got to love yourself for that.
So say something more about what's hard about this.
Well, you just have to you have to have a certain amount of trust and faith in each other and myself. You have to understand that the predictability you long for isn't going to be there. And you have to endure the disappointment of people you're there to serve, because 1/3 of the kids in your class are going to hate this. Even if it's successful, they're going to say, "How was that class?" And they said, "I don't know, a guy broke us into small groups. I didn't learn anything about history."
I've heard that. When I go into school systems in India, and we're working with the teachers, 1/3 don't want to be in the room at all. 1/3 are polite, and 1/3 are interested on a good day. So yeah, that's part of it. There's a resistance. But what I find is that people migrate with the experience.
They bring each other along eventually. So you don't have to work on the most resistant ones. People give you a hard time, you say, good point.
I notice that you do that.
I do that all the
I've
time.
always appreciated that.
Other than at home. That's another story. All right.
Thank
We're
you.
done.
We're done.
Thanks.
Perfect.